Welcome everyone who's joined us already. We'll just in about 5 seconds get going. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Helping Children Thrive in an Age of Uncertainty. My name is Eric Deering, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mary E. Walsh Center for Thriving Children, which is in the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College. Before turning the proceedings over to our esteemed panelists, I would like to provide you with just a very brief introduction to the Center for Thriving Children and how today's forum fits into the exciting work happening at the center. Our mission in the Center for Thriving Children, broadly speaking, is to advance science, implementation, and innovation to promote children and youth thriving. And for over 2 decades now, the core of this work has occurred through the intervention City Connects. City Connects, if you're not familiar with it, is a research practice partnership that at the latest count has reached over 50,000 children, and many of those children being in some of the most disadvantaged school districts in the US. It's also now in Dublin, Ireland, and was developed by its executive director, Professor Mary Walsh, using the school, primarily elementary schools, but now it has grown also into middle schools and high schools and beyond, but using those schools as a hub for connecting children and families with community-based resources that enrich and build on strengths, while also addressing the many serious needs that you all know arise from systemic inequity, both in education and life. And it's on this legacy and impact of City Connects that we're now growing scholar initiatives in the Center for Thriving Children to help advance knowledge and practice on systemic approaches to helping children thrive. We're hoping to build a more robust knowledge around how to provide equitable and enduring opportunities for children, families, and communities. And we're sincerely grateful to have all of you here today with us to help launch this work. And we're hoping that you'll be interested in keeping up to date with the many events and scholar programs and announcements that are coming soon from the center. And so you'll find in the chat, we'll be providing a link where we encourage you to sign up for center news and other publications. But without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today's event, who will then introduce our panelists. Our moderator is Jackie Mader. Jackie is a senior early childhood reporter for the Hechinger Report, which is a nonprofit education news outlet. And she's also currently a Spencer Foundation Fellow at Columbia University School of Journalism, from where she's reporting on childcare policy. So welcome, Jackie. We're delighted to have you moderate this conversation.
Thank you so much, Eric. And hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel today. A quick note before we get started to add to what Eric was saying, we would love to know more about you all who are here. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say where you're zooming in from, and also the chat will be open for questions throughout the panel. So please feel free to add your question and also put your name and organization, and we will get to those at the end of the session. So with that, I'm really excited to be moderating this conversation. As Eric mentioned, I report a lot on childcare. So for me, this concept of thriving comes up a lot when reporting on childcare quality. And I frequently speak to experts about this idea that we've accepted a standard of childcare that is just good enough. And I think we know good enough doesn't really mean thriving. So this is a topic that I frequently come across in my own work. But at the same time, I know childcare is just a part of the many things that impact a child's life and whether they are thriving. So that's why I'm especially excited to hear from our 4 experts who have incredible, diverse areas of experience. And I'm confident they will help all of us kind of expand our view of what children need to thrive and also help us dig deeper into areas that we may not be focusing on as much in our own work. So that is actually one of the goals of today's panel that I have. So by the time we're done, I really hope that all of us will walk away with a better understanding of what it means for children to thrive, and you will have some ideas of areas where maybe we're seeing some hope and actionable steps we can take to help more children thrive. So enough of me, let's get to our panelists. I'm going to introduce the 4 of them. First, we have Dr. Aisha Yousafzai, who's a professor of child development and health in the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. We have Dr. Henrik Zachrisson, a developmental psychologist and professor at the Center for Research on Equality in Education at the University of Oslo. We have Dr. Richard Murnane, an economist who is the Thompson Research Professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And Dr. Vivian Gadsden, William T. Carter Professor of Child Development and Education, Learning Teacher and Literacies Division at Penn Graduate School of Education. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. We're going to jump into the conversation. Our panel revolves around this concept of thriving. And I'm curious to hear how the definition of thriving may differ for each of you and what it may encompass, just based on your different expertise and focus areas. So to start us off, I would love each of you to just briefly define what thriving means to you in the context of children. Vivian, could we start with you maybe?
Of course. Thank you so much, Jackie. And I am very appreciative to the Mary Walsh Center for this opportunity to participate in the webinar. So in response to your question, I will say what it is not limited to or what it is not. As my colleagues, Pamela Cantor and David Osher and his colleagues suggest, and certainly from my own work and experience, I will say that it is more than well-being, even though much of what I write says well-being. And it builds upon the concept of flourishing. It is not resilience, nor is it simply survival. And it is more than the absence of problems or the development of basic competencies. Say from Osher and from Cantor and others, it is a dynamic and holistic process that involves children, youth, and adults and within communities and in families influencing each other all the time, in the moment, as well as over time. And so it is a life course trajectory that we are really focused on. Our own experiences and expectations give us a sense of what it means to thrive on the one hand, because we have had circumstances and conditions that facilitate our thriving, or on the other hand, because we have not been born into such positive situations and circumstances. And so we're constantly looking for prototypes for how we might embrace the concept.
Thanks so much. And we'll dig more into how we do that next. Richard, what is your definition?
Well, I would build on Vivian's, which I think is terrific, and just perhaps add two things. One is high quality support for dealing with socio-emotional problems, which most children encounter at one time or another, and which the pandemic has intensified for a great many children and youth, and for immigrant children, and there's a growing number of them. Many of them have experienced trauma in their home countries, and they really need support for learning to deal with those in order for them to be able to learn and develop. And I guess more generally, opportunities beginning at birth to develop interests and talents and receive the high quality education beginning very early that they need to live a fulfilling life and support their children and those around them.
Great, thank you. Henrik, what about you?
To build on what Vivian and Richard just said, I mean, I'm not a native English speaker, so I started with the dictionary. And the dictionary defines thriving as prosper or flourish, as growing rich, or of a child, animal, or a plant to grow vigorously. And that made me think, this is interesting because I'm an empirical researcher, and most of what I do circles around test scores or measures of behavior problems, which is kind of the first part of this, growing rich, prosper, succeeding in society. While the other part might be a little bit more neglected, at least in our empirical research, which is about growing from a seed into a beautiful flower.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, since we don't have a real equivalent word in Norwegian, which is my first language, I was thinking of this in terms of living a safe life with purpose and joy and happiness and kind of meaningful relationships to other. And thinking of this, those two outcomes of development and developmental processes, as Vivian mentioned, are not necessarily correlated. They might be, but they might not. Think of a kid who doesn't do well in school, but is super engaged in the dance crew and teaches younger kids to dance, has a very meaningful interest in this, creates a community with friends and support. Would we think of that kid as thriving? Perhaps. Would we know that from at least our empirical research? Most likely not, because we don't ask. So it kind of made me think of thriving as much more than what I usually address in my research, which was a very stimulating starting point for this conversation.
I love that. That's really interesting. Thank you, Henrik. Aisha, what about you?
So I concur with my colleagues, but I want to emphasize maybe a couple of things, and I come at this very much from a global perspective. And I think about what kind of world we want the next generation of children to grow up to inhabit and how they are equipped and ready to deal with that world. And if we envision a world where all children have the opportunity to thrive in very much the ways that Vivian and Richard and Henrik have described, then we hope that they will have the skills that they need to really be engaged citizens in that 21st century, where they'll be creative, where they'll be able to build positive relationships, where they'll be able to innovate and navigate the complexities of the world that they inherit. But the reality is that we live in a very unequal world, and as already has been alluded to, and much of how we think about thriving, both in terms of the risk to it, but also in terms of the solutions to it, come from what we learn and the formal knowledge that we have generated from a minority of countries and a minority of children in the world. So 90% of the world's children live in the majority world, live in low and middle income countries. Yet in terms of our formal knowledge, if we think about the scientific knowledge, only a small proportion of that knowledge really comes from the lived experiences and the strengths and the capabilities of children and families and their communities from the majority world. And I think that as we go forward, we need to be encapsulating that knowledge and those experiences into that image and that picture of all children thriving.
Thank you so much. I love that. All of you had such important thoughts, and I want to dig in more on this. So, how do children thrive? What do they need to thrive, again, from your different perspectives? And Henrik, maybe we can start with you. I was just reporting in Norway and was just so struck by all the supports Norway has. So, just starting with your perspective, as a Norwegian, what do children need to thrive? How do you view that?
Yeah, I thought I would start off by offering kind of a perspective which is perhaps a little bit foreign to some non-Northern Europeans. So in Norway, which is a very weird country, we have a universal public early education system, and children are offered slots in early education system at a highly subsidized rate from age 1 through the beginning of school. And what I want to emphasize here is kind of the underlying philosophy in the early education system in Norway, which is kind of an interesting perspective, because embedded actually in our legal text and in our national guidelines for the content of public early education services is a thought of childhood as having an intrinsic value. which is supposed to be nurtured and protected. And this might be a little bit in a contrast to what I believe in this room, virtual room, is a straw man, but thinking of childhood as a production stage towards some taxpayer or value producing adult. But the early education system in Norway is circled around well, I don't think there is an English equivalent, but the German construct of Bildung. So the idea of approaching the development of a person as a holistic process where understanding democracy and citizenship, arts and creativity, as well as language development and foundations for mathematical learning, is kind of part of an integrated approach to thinking of childhood in the development of the wider development of a person. Which is, again, a bit distant from how I usually approach this empirically. But it is a perspective on the broader philosophy of allowing children to thrive, I guess.
Thank you so much. Moving to the United States perspective, Richard, what do you think about this question? How do children thrive? What do they need to thrive?
Thank you, Jackie. As Henrik said, Norway is a peculiar country. And it's smaller, it's much more homogeneous, it's different in many ways. So it's hard to know quite what comparisons to draw. On the other hand, Canada is next door. It has the same basic language, same traditions, large immigration rate. So in many respects, it has many similarities to the US. However, their children fare much better. Much larger percentage of them thrive. Well, key reasons are universal pre-K in Canada, universal health care, child allowance, many months of paid parental care after a child is born, so parents can help children start off in life. So I think these are things that our next door neighbor is able to do. There's really no reason financially that we cannot do that as well, but we don't.
Thank you. Aisha, what are your thoughts on this from working with a lot of other countries?
So I think that we have a good understanding, at least at the population level, of kind of the multiple risks that young children in particular face and their families face in being able to support them to thrive. And the response to that, I think, in part has to begin with a recognition that we need multi-sectoral policies and actions. And, these need to be able to work in a way that makes it easy for families to navigate across health, across social protection, and across education, because I think this is where families with young children can slip through the gaps. It's often really difficult to negotiate and navigate your way around all the things that you're entitled to and you have the right to access. So just as an example, in terms of, some of the rather entrenched risks that the majority of young children face around the world, we know that close to 400 million children around the world are growing up in extreme poverty. That's less than $1.90 a day, which means that we can't think about addressing these challenges unless we think about good access to social protection that works for the context that children are growing up in. And that will look differently whether you're in Pakistan or in the US or in Malawi. Where children are free from hunger, you can't thrive, you can't learn if you are hungry, right? And so how do we ensure that we can bridge those kind of gaps across health, nutrition, and the opportunities that young children have to thrive? And we know that there are these other global threats that are embedding those inequalities. So about 41% of the refugee population are children. And that number is growing and will continue to grow because of the conflicts, because of climate change. And it's important, going back to the very first comments that Vivian made, that yes, we think about those basic necessities that children need: learning, education, social protection, and health. But having worked with a wonderful organization called AMNA, I'm always reminded that we can't forget the other key things that young children and their families express a need for when they're in displaced or refugee settings, which is a sense of joy and a sense of belonging, not losing their sense of identity. And so when we think about building this holistic picture of inputs and services, we have to also remember that there are some very basic things that we have a moral obligation to ensure that children have access to, but we cannot forget these important things that we all find essential in our lives, right? And that's that sense of joy, that sense of belonging. And so I think that that's harder to think about how we bring that into these very complex risk environments, but it's a reminder that they shouldn't be negated.
Thank you. I love that you brought joy into it. That's something that a lot of people may not think about, right? You're thinking about basic needs, but that is really critical. Vivian, what about you? What are your thoughts on this?
So I come into so much of this by being reminded of finding that my colleagues here shared a few years ago about children, young children in the city of Philadelphia. And that was that a little over 50% of these children were experiencing at least a couple of risks. And those risks range from housing to neglect to a number of other factors. So I'm always thinking of thriving as children being healthy and well-educated in the broadest sense. In the narrower sense, having rich cognitive and social experiences, for example, to achieve in school and enjoy learning, and sometimes those two aren't completely compatible, but also to develop and live with agency and confidence, to be successful in social relationships, and to be able to manage the highs and the lows of social interactions, to be emotionally grounded, to have access to the human resources that families and friends and communities provide, to be able to count on educational and social systems that are fair, just, equitable, and do not discriminate by the various markers of their identities. And in short, to move back to this idea of joy, to have the ability to dream and believe that they can achieve their dreams. I think that is just very core. And I think about that in relationship to how this might be integrated and assume a position of prominence in the lives of those children who are in the 50% who are experiencing multiple risk. But I do believe that children thrive in large part because of the relationships between and among systems, the impact of complex systems, and their ability to navigate those systems. There are new and expansive paradigms in research and across fields regarding how human learning unfolds and how humans developed. And they suggest that we should be moving toward an integrated understanding of those dynamic relations between and among context, linking the physical, the social, emotional, and cognitive processes that children have, and being able to embrace the perceptions of the self, the tasks, the settings, and the emotional salience of experience. I would say that very much at the center of that is thinking about timing. So temporal factors are at play, as well as issues of context. And then the next very quick thing I will say is that they thrive in and with families and communities who care and who make a difference in their lives and take on the role and the responsibility of supporting their children and having a vision of possibility for them. At the same time, parents and families and communities are contexts intended to protect, but there are also places where children, youths, and adults often grapple with tough issues. They use the resources available to them to position their children to inch along toward thriving. And I have been reminded of the salience of this through two examples. Very quickly, I'll give them to you. I have two former graduate students, one of whom focused on young children's understanding of their immediate environments and of the political and social context. And what was really striking about these young children, all under the age of 8, is the ways in which they could articulate very clearly how they understood what was happening in our world. And keep in mind that this is between about 2018 and 2021. The ways in which they attached meaning to the various news reports that they heard, and also the ways in which they internalized what they understood, particularly when these African-American children in particular were hearing that the parents of other African-American children whom they could see had been brutalized. And in the second, another graduate student focusing on parents and families, trying to understand whether and how they could support their children during summer loss. And in this case, this was a reminder of how much parents do that we don't understand. He did the work, much of the work during the pandemic, but what he found was that, in fact, these parents were doing such incredible things with their children every day, with minimal resources because they were in low-income families. And they described the goals for their children in terms of well-being, but they mostly described what they wanted for their children in terms of thriving. Because I don't think any of us have known many parents who say that they just want their children to achieve well-being. They want their children to thrive. They want their children to understand the possibilities that exist for them. And it is a very strategic place for schools to support parents in the most meaningful and purposeful ways possible.
Thanks so much, Vivian. And we'll get more into solutions. You brought up some important solutions. We'll get more into that later. So I'd love to hear more. I want to get to solutions, but I also think it's important to kind of set the stage realistically on where we are and what the challenges are. So based on each of your areas of work and experience, I would love to hear what do you see are the key challenges facing children that are keeping them from thriving? Richard, maybe can we start with you?
Sure. At the root, being low-income parents, it's still possible, as Vivian just described, to raise healthy children who thrive. But it's vastly more difficult than it is in a great many other countries. Some evidence for that is that the rate of intergenerational economic mobility is lower in the United States than it is in Canada and virtually every relatively affluent European country. Now, what that means, that's a big expression, is if you grow up poor, the chances that your child will grow up poor are much higher in the US than in other countries. And at the other extreme, if you grow up in a wealthy family, the chance that your children will be wealthy are much higher than in most other countries. Now, among the reasons for that, again, are lack of parental paid leave, uncertain work schedules. You know, a great many low-income parents work in retail jobs where they don't know until Friday of the previous week what their schedule is going to be for the next week. Think about the challenges that means for sleep, for high-quality childcare, and I could go on, but I want others to have a chance.
Thanks so much. Aisha.
So perhaps what I'll do is unpack some of the multiple risks that we have data for at the population level globally, because then I think as we think about the solutions, we have to be able to figure out how do we bring all of these problems into our thinking about solutions. And, you know, to start off, when you're growing up in a resource-constrained setting, there's always a tension between this idea of survival and the idea of thriving. So where does a country with very low income invest, right? Where does it make its choices? So we've made huge progress in children's survival, but we still have just over 5 million children dying before their 5th birthday from things that are preventable, right? So things like complications during pregnancy and delivery, or treatable illnesses like respiratory tract infections or diarrheal disease. So that's one piece of it. It's making those investment choices, and how can we bring these two things together rather than see them as survival and thriving as competing agendas. And then I think, you know, of the children that survive, many more do survive. We need to think about the quality of their survival. And so how do you tackle things like the very large numbers of children who are malnourished, who have very low opportunity for early childhood care and education? I work in a country where only 20% of 3 to 5-year-olds have access to any kind of early childhood care and education service. And that's simply talking about access. It's not even touching on issues of quality. As I've already mentioned, in terms of safety and security, about 1/3 of children aren't even formally registered at birth, which can be an impediment to access to services, tracking things like immunization, enrolling children in early learning programs. And then we think about the needs of their families. So not only, as has been mentioned, poverty alleviation, but we have a growing sort of understanding that the pandemic shone a lens on of mental health globally. And again, when we look at the inequities across the world, we know that antenatal depression, postpartum depression is twice the rate in low and middle income countries than it is in high income countries. And that's before we even start to unpack things that we have very little data on, which is father's depression or other factors that are important in terms of families' well-being that can then support their young children. So I think that gives us a kind of picture of you know, that yes, we have lots of things that might work, but the complexity of getting all these things to come together is part of where some of our thinking needs to go forward in.
Thank you so much. Vivian, did you want to respond and share your thoughts on this?
Well, I think Aisha did a great job. I will just reiterate a few things actually that were said earlier. One is that both nationally and globally, we have something in common, even though the statistics may differ, and that is that children are overrepresented among the poor. Globally, about 1 billion children are what has been described as multidimensionally poor. And that is, as Aisha noted earlier, lacking kind of basic resources. But I would also say that our challenge is to think about the point at which we focus on this issue. And I think Henrik said earlier, it would be at birth, or before birth, actually, to think about how we might address some of the items that Aisha mentioned, prenatal care for mothers to be, and that we have a plan for how we can move children and families toward a more positive trajectory. I would also say very quickly that in the US, it is a problem of systems not being in communication with each other. And so when we talk about the integration of efforts to reduce the complexities of systems, particularly systems that we know have so much inequity embedded in them that it's very hard to tease out or even know the extent of the inequity. We have a huge challenge. And so no one system represents all of the issues faced by children and their families. And so part of what we need to do, in my opinion, in the US is think more directly about what it will take to move children and families out of poverty. A recent report from the National Academies of Sciences is entitled Reducing Intergenerational Poverty, and it's worth reading. And the thing that I found appealing, one of the many things I found appealing about the report, is the way in which it began by acknowledging the incredible complexities around racial discrimination and the history of racism in the US, and the ways in which that racism has really permeated the kind of basic functioning of systems that create what we now refer to as barriers from systems, or systemic racism, or structural barriers. There is no easy way to deconstruct those barriers, but we have to be deliberate so that we can address the multi-dimensional issues facing children who are constantly faced with the threat of poverty, of poor care, of parents who are unable to support them because of a number of factors, homelessness, and the multiplicity of other factors that really put children at enormous risk.
Thanks so much, Vivian. Henrik, I would love to hear, what are you seeing as the biggest challenges for children in Norway?
In Norway, well, I think this builds on actually what all of my colleagues, but particularly Vivian, mentioned now, and I don't think this applies just to Norway. I mean, life is a big thing for child. There are so many arenas throughout development, more and more different arenas the older the kids grow. And thinking of thriving in terms of opportunities across kind of all of the arenas where, I mean, in the US, in Norway, where kids go to preschool, they go to school, they go to after school activities, they hang out in their community, they go to after sports or whatever. The discrepancies or gaps in the opportunities across the entire life which faces children, particularly children of low-income parents. I think thinking of this as a cumulative load of opportunities or absence of opportunities. And in the case of the risk, it's the cumulative absence of opportunities for thriving, which is my great concern, not only in Norway, but everywhere.
Thank you so much. We've laid out a lot of challenges, and I don't want this to feel insurmountable because I know a lot of great work is being done. All of you have participated in work trying to kind of fight these challenges. So I want to turn to solutions. What needs to happen? How do we make this happens so that more children can thrive, especially in equitable ways. So maybe some practical, actionable steps. And if any of you have examples of bright spots where you've already seen some growth where more children are able to thrive, I think we would all love to hear them. So feel free, whoever feels moved to answer first, go ahead. Yeah, Henrik.
May I chime in with this is a very Northern European perspective to the solution, which is about a way of thinking. So in a way, my mom used to say that you need to choose your parents with care. And of course, we don't choose our parents. She was ironic. But the Northern European way of thinking of this is that you may have a lucky draw or a less lucky draw when you choose your parents. The role of society is metaphorically to think of as an insurance against the unlucky draw. So with insurance, we pay money, something happens to us for which we are not responsible, like choosing parents who are not able to provide us with everything we need. And then we have a society which takes that responsibility and provides opportunities which our parents can't, or provide our parents with opportunities to be parents in a way they otherwise wouldn't be able to. So I think it's a very un-American, I believe, way of thinking about kind of the role of society in children's lives, but it's pretty strong here. And I'm actually curious whether my colleagues here kind of see some resonance in that way of starting the question of how to address the support of children to thrive from that perspective.
I'd be glad to add a few things. Is that okay, Jackie? Go ahead.
Yes, please jump in. Go ahead.
You know, there were two no-brainers: universal pre-K, universal health care. Most Western countries have them. There's no reason we can't have them. The evidence is overwhelming that they make a huge difference in the lives of children. I suggest two others that are quite different. One is elimination of unstable work schedules. That's something, a few big cities are trying that. That is requiring companies to make schedules more stable, so parents don't end up in the situation of having to close a McDonald's at 11 o'clock and then open it again at 6 o'clock the next morning. The consequences for children are immense. And the evidence, the growing evidence, is that stable work schedules really make a difference. One other thing I'd say that's really quite different: reform the juvenile justice system. We know that adolescents make mistakes. We've learned a great deal over the last 25 years about brain development in adolescence. Adolescents make mistakes. Youths of color from low-income families make mistakes. So do white youths from middle-class families. But the consequences for that first group are very different. And that is a fundamental problem in our society.
This is why I love this conversation, because there's so many entrance points, it sounds like, where you can start working on this. Vivian, were you going to chime in there?
Yes, I thank you, Richard, for saying those things. They're on my list. I would also say it's a perfect time for schools to think about what they can do, and different and better kinds of investments in schools, and in the nature of schooling itself. Working more strategically with teachers and preparing them for the diversity of students whom they will teach, but also making schools safe and responsive havens for children and families. So much of what we're talking about, and so much of what I actually do, focuses on what happens out of school. But there is a relationship. Kids are making transitions and walking between schools and homes and across communities all the time. What is it that we want schools to be able to achieve. So some of it has to do with the academic experiences that children have in schools and the relational experiences that exist there. But on a more basic level, it has to do with the ways in which schools understand and are able to capitalize on the context in which they are situated. There are a number of strategic ways that people are learning about the settings in which they are located. Most cities have these wonderful administrative, data sets. Yet there are so little often understood by the people in school about the specifics of what happens to kids in their neighborhoods. There are countless examples of children who have been mislabeled or about which the schools don't have enough information simply because certain kinds of questions have not been asked. And I have said in other places, and I will say it here, that we should think about what counts as useful information at each level. Using the child as a source of information, but also preparing schools to work more effectively with parents and understanding the communities that form the context. I would just say something else that's going to be a little different than what other people may say. In terms of research and what researchers can do, there is a growing number of what we call research practice partnerships, RPPs. And a lot of support has come from foundations such as the Spencer Foundation and W.T. Grant, Kellogg, and a few others, asking researchers to think across different disciplines and fields and contexts. They also ask that this researching will engage local communities and policymakers alike in the co-construction of programs. And so I think being able to capitalize on some of that work would be very useful and make sure that it doesn't stay with the researchers. One of the possibilities of RPPs is that actually people who are engaged in practice are co-constructors of what the research will look like. And then after that happens, I'm hoping that it won't simply be in research journals, as much as I like research journals, but it will be a part of an active discussion and active dialogue within practice, but also between practitioners and the communities that they serve.
Thanks so much, Vivian. And Richard put some books in the chat for all of you to look at that is related. I would also add, Vivian has a great talk on this. I think it was 2016 is the one I found, a TED Talk, big data, medium data, little data. Yeah, related to that. Yeah, collecting data. I found it really fascinating. So if you want to read more on or listen to more on that point, you can look that up. Aisha, to you on this question of solutions.
So first of all, 100% agree with Vivian about the way we think about knowledge generation and who owns that knowledge. Just should be at the forefront, right? Giving more voice to communities and the solutions that they have over their own experiences comes from those partnerships. Perhaps I want to maybe flag a way forward that focuses our attention on the systems that serve young children, that serve children and their families. And we have a lot of knowledge about what sorts of inputs work, right? Whether that's pre-K, good quality and universal access to healthcare, whether those are parenting programs delivered through home visits. These are things that we know if children and their families could access could be beneficial if done with quality. But I think that if we want to really increase the momentum and the drive in terms of the numbers of children having access, more equitable access and better quality of these services, we need to think from a systems lens in two areas. The first is investing in our workforce. So when I think of the early childhood workforce in particular, whether it's home visitors in the US or whether it's childcare workers everywhere, they are undervalued, poorly paid. In some parts of the world, we expect this to be voluntary labor. And unless we really place value on the early childhood or the workforce, we're not going to see a really big, substantial change, right? We need to value and center this workforce. And I think, again, the pandemic shed light on actually childcare workers are essential. Preschool teachers are essential, and they do much more than just help our children to read and write. They are serving as places of safety and protection for our children. They're doing so much more, but yet we continue to underinvest. And so I think that's one area that's really important. And connected to that, I think we need to frame some of our systems thinking, not just around equity, but specifically around gender equity. And this is partly because I think a lot of our programs, they are designed to benefit children, but we also have to think about how they're impacting a largely female-driven workforce and largely mothers or female caregivers that take on the larger share, rightly or wrongly, the larger share of the caregiving responsibilities within families. And so thinking about, do we have the right policies in place, whether it comes to parental leave, whether we have subsidized access to childcare services, whether we have child-friendly workspaces, the flexibility that Richard was referring to. I think if we think about these through a gender equity frame, we are not only changing the way we think about how we design systems, but how we measure the outcomes of these systems so that there are benefits both to children, but also to their caregivers. So I think those are two things that I really, really wanted to make sure we're out there in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Aisha. That idea of supporting family and children, I know, became very prevalent during the pandemic with the trickle down concept, right? So supporting parents will then trickle down to support children. We can spend more time on solutions later in the session. Now I want to turn to, we have 3 invited responses from members of the Boston College Lynch School of Education and Human Development. And just a reminder, also, the chat is open for questions. We've gotten some wonderful ones already. Feel free to add more during this. So our 3 responses. So first will be from Katarina Sauter, who is a senior at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College, majoring in both elementary education and applied psychology. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Catalina Guerra. She has a PhD in applied developmental psychology from the Lynch School, and her research focuses on promoting gender equity, so similar to what Aisha, you were just talking about, in early learning opportunities and parental practices to promote young boys and girls' healthy development and parental well-being across the globe. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Earl Edwards, Director of the Housing and Educational Equity Lab at Boston College. Earl is also an assistant professor at Boston College's Educational Leadership Program. And his scholarship and practice focuses on the impact of structural racism on public institutions in the United States and on training educational leaders and policymakers to create systems to proactively address racial inequities. So these should be, a great follow-up to a lot of the points we've brought up. Katarina, I will hand it over to you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation so far, and it's given me so much to think about, especially as someone entering into the field of education. And I was curious if you have any advice you would give someone who's just starting to enter the world of education, and what can I do, what can future teachers do to ensure that children are thriving?
Great question. Who would like to answer that one?
I would take a quick stab. I would say our research group is spending a lot of time looking at how Massachusetts high schools are serving newcomers. That means the growing number of young people coming from other countries who are English learners. And one of the things there is the importance of having teachers talk a lot with each other and develop a culture of high expectations for these young people, but also recognize it's a very difficult job and it can't be left to the English teachers. It's got to be everybody's work.
Great. Does anyone else? Yeah, Vivian.
Oh, well said, Richard. I think the first thing is to also, as a person going into the field, don't hold back your imagination. And be open to hearing and learning from children and their families, balancing the book knowledge that you will go in with a way of thinking about how you will enter into the families and the communities that are nurturing sites for the children whom you will teach. I think that to keep in mind that it's not one point in time, that you never know everything you need to know, no matter how much you know. And to think about resources, if you're going to be a teacher, think of yourself as a practitioner scholar, as a teacher scholar. And that means always being engaged with the literature, being a part of organizations that will help keep your ideas, crisp and your motivations sincere. And lastly, not to be dismayed by complexity.
Great. Katarina, do you have any other questions, or are you good to move on?
And you'll be great.
Great. Catalina, I turn it to you.
Thanks, Jackie. And well, first of all, I want to thank you so much, the panelists, for sharing all those important insights and bringing such a rich and diverse perspective on how children can thrive in these current times of uncertainty and hardship. And I have two key takeaways that I would like to highlight that were very impressive for me. And one is that, well, we agree that thriving goes beyond surviving, but these two cannot be competing agendas. And that I realized while hearing you all talk, but rather two different places from which we can offer the best and most equitable opportunities possible for children and families to achieve this goal of making children thrive. And second, that we do have to be aware of the multidimensionality of these challenges that we're talking about, which place barriers for families and children in so many contexts and levels. And I also want to highlight something that Dr. Gadsden mentioned, and it is the fact of how much parents do, as you mentioned, Dr. Gadsden, to keep their children thriving, and all those things we still don't understand very well. And these are incredible things, amazing things that parents do, both mothers and fathers, with very few resources. And we haven't added this to the equation, to the solution equation. So I wanted to pose this question to the panelists of how can we use that family's strengths, the knowledge, and those creative actions that they do every day to make it part of the solution equation, as I'm calling it, recognizing their agency and the key role in helping children thrive from the academia perspective, the public policy perspective, the programs development perspective that we are constantly working on from our side, to achieve the goal of helping children, for example, Dr. Gadsden mentioned the RPPs, the research practice partnerships, or Dr. Yousafzai, you mentioned giving voice to the families and the communities. But Can you talk a little bit more about the actionable steps towards co-constructing with families as being part of the solutions that we want to achieve?
Great question. So how do we take actionable steps to, yes, involve families more? Aisha, did you want to grab that?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I just want to sort of give you a little bit of I want to be able to share a little bit of my experience or my approach to work. So much of my work really focuses on thinking about interventions and implementation in the parenting space. And I've had the good fortune of thinking about my research always in partnership with communities, and thinking about that first step, those tangible steps when I think, okay, I need to understand the context and I want to understand families' priorities, family strengths, families and community resources. And so, you know, there are multiple research methods, but going back to what Professor Gadsden was referring to as these community partnerships, and really investing a great deal of time in that qualitative work, of really that community participatory work, where we really ask families what it is that they have support needs around, what are their priorities, and also where are their strengths, you know, what are they, identify what is going really well and build from that strengths-based approach. Because I think we can all point to the evidence that tells us a lot of the ingredients that need to go in a parenting program, but how they look, how they're shaped, and how we make sure they're responsive to a context and a community can only come from that first step. And that not to leave it at that point, but to ensure that we keep going back to the community, sharing what we think is working, asking them what they think is working. And as academics, I think we have a responsibility of putting value on those methodologies as much as we do on the sort of the randomized control trial. All of these methods should be able to be part of the solution.
Great. Thank you so much, Aisha. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Yeah, Henrik, go ahead. Oh, you're muted still, Henrik.
Sorry. I just want to add from a very different perspective to support what Aisha said. So Richard mentioned essentially job security and predictability, but there is so much we can do as societies to allow parents the space to be good parents. And it's not only restricted to what Richard mentioned, which isn't super important, but it also entails being allowed to stay home with a sick kid, having 40-hour work week instead of 45 hours, etc., etc., etc. Job security when kids are sick, even long-term sick. So it's the structural component of allowing parents to have the space they need to be good parents is a common responsibility. And as far as I know, we have no evidence that those work regulations restrict productivity at the global scale. So I think we have a way to go, starting both from the grassroots and at systemic level there.
Great point. Thank you so much. Earl, moving on to you. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So I'm very honored to be here and to be able to reflect on such a great conversation. A couple of things that kind of struck me was one, when Aisha talked about who's in the data set, right? Who's in our data corpus, and how so many folks are, so many children are not included in the analysis that we actually have. It made me think of also like how we talk about different populations. And so thinking about Black students and also thinking about low-income students and the deficit frames that we often have, and when we talk about those populations and how that has a negative impact on how people receive them, but also our solutions. And this paradigm of well-being and also thinking about thriving, and how focusing on well-being can often lead us into directions that aren't necessarily healthy for our actual children. I think of strict charter school kind of policies are really kind of focusing on teaching to the test, and how that becomes a manifestation of ideas of market values and also ideas of getting kids through, rather than thinking about this idea about actually thriving. And Henrik said something that really stuck with me, something to the extent of childhood within itself is valuable. And Vivian also talked about having the opportunity to dream. And it really makes me think of freedom dreaming that folks talk about oftentimes, and also this opportunity to have the luxury of having the space to actually think about those things. In today's society, particularly around structural racism, there's been a lot of policies that have been coming out that's actually restricting Black people and also low-income people from the opportunity to learn and also thrive. And so I wondered, what is our responsibility as researchers to, one, use empirical evidence to really push back on some of the policies that are out right now that is preventing folks from learning their history, having a critical perspective on actually what's going on in the world, not thinking about the environment, also addressing things like homelessness, and also pushing back against a really big political push to really force people to have policies that are restrictive and that's not allowing them to actually thrive. What role should we be playing as researchers, but also what extended role should educators be playing more broadly?
Another great question. Who wants to take that first?
Maybe I just make a couple of very brief points. So I think the first is, I think we need to make better use of the data that we do have available. And I think often, at least in the work that I do, there's a tendency to not look at the heterogeneity of our samples, particularly when we have large samples. So, whether it's a US database, whether it's an international database, I think trying to look for some of kind of the understanding through that heterogeneity based on people's ethnic backgrounds, their color, whether they're indigenous, non-indigenous populations. I think that's one area. The other, and I think this is really critical, and I think while we've definitely made progress in diversifying the academy itself in terms of academics of color from minority backgrounds, I think we have a responsibility to continue to nurture and mentor people that we don't lose along the way in those career pathways. I think I don't have a solution for how we do that and get better at it, but I just think it's something we need to not lose sight of. I haven't been in the US long enough to fully sort of understand all those pathways, but just to say that I think it's something we have to continually be aware of.
Thanks, Aisha.
I will just say quickly, thank you for that question. Thank all three of you for your questions. That as researchers, we have to think about responsibility as an achievable goal, and figure out what that means to us and how we will enact that sense of responsibility for the people whom we study and about whom we care. I think there are kind of multiple layers. I think of two broad areas, though. One is a lot of work has been done and a lot of talk takes place about communities. And I have some colleagues here who are doing just incredible work, community-based work. And certainly universities are increasingly concerned about how they will contribute to communities. But I also think that these things have to happen in tandem. That while we are doing work with communities and who have a range of issues that they are trying to grapple with, particularly those who have communities that have been historically marginalized by race and class in particular. We also have to be talking about the systems. Because part of the reason that the communities are struggling as they are struggling is that there are systems that aren't really working in the way that we expect them to work. And I'm not going to minimize the importance of the work that people do, but as reminders, systems are constituted by people. They're not, some abstract structure that is not malleable. And they are constituted by people who care about, many of the issues. And so I think the challenge going forward is to be able to match those issues that have to do with communities and those issues that have to do with systems. I think researchers are in part some of the solution to thinking through that. People in areas like yours of policy are going to be instrumental in helping us formulate new ideas of what that might be. What would it mean? And I will say this because it's something I talk about at my own institution. What would it mean for researchers to be facilitators or supporters of systemic change, right? As we are criticizing the systems, and I often do a pretty good job of that, what does it mean for us to go and work in the systems to try to affect change? And it's hard work. So it's not for the faint of heart, but there has to be some way in which that we can see some synchrony between the experiences that people have in these in communities, particularly those that are struggling, and the support that the systems that are designed to facilitate their progress, their well-being, their thriving. And then lastly, I will say that thriving is both an immediate goal and an aspiration at the same time. And we have to think about the ways in which we get to thriving. We map thriving against issues of equity. And we think about the potential transformative nature of both.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Edwards, Dr. Guerra, and Katarina for your responses and those questions. That was really powerful to hear those different perspectives. And we're moving into more questions now with our Q&A portion. Feel free to continue submitting questions if you want. Oh, and we even have a thriving child right there.
I was thinking that.
Oh, I love it. My own 5-year-old is home with pink eye right now, so we are not thriving, but he may show up soon too. All right, so questions. We are going to go. So this is a question, Henrik, I believe this is one of your colleagues, Astrid Sanser, the associate professor at the University of Oslo. Great question. So while I'm just going to read it, so forgive me. While a lot of focus is on childcare expansion, I want to ask about childcare content. Norway has an ongoing debate where a suggestion to introduce more structured play has met pushback from proponents of free play. This is a very different setting from countries like the US, but what should the optimal balance between allowing children to be children and giving children early learning opportunities be, particularly when we know achievement gaps are large when children enter kindergarten/school? It's a great question. Who would like to take that? And let me know if you want me to repeat any of it.
If I could give just a very brief kind of a personal response. Greg Duncan and I wrote a book a few years ago that was called Restoring Opportunity. And we had, to support the book, we had public television create 3 videos. One was of the Boston pre-K program that we thought was really quite good. And it does have a serious curriculum, but it also is very much student activities, is very child-centered. And we thought that satisfied this for play. I asked a colleague who is from Finland to look at the video, and her response was not nearly enough play, too structured. So I think it depends on one's perspective.
I love that, Richard. Yeah, Vivian, go ahead.
I will say that personally, I'm a purist. I like play for for its fundamental opportunity for discovery and creativity and imagination. However, I also have seen, I also had a colleague here once who was famous for the study of play. I have appreciated, however, some of the work that's come out around more structured play. I have colleagues in literacy who have been doing interesting work collecting, using the knowledge that they have gained from their work on play to enhance children's early reading, writing, and literacy. So, it's a catch-22 in some ways, but I think there is a lot to be learned from free play. We just have to figure out how to record that because it is different. Once you start telling kids how to play, you are really then measuring something or looking at something that's not of their own doing. Ultimately, it becomes something of their own doing, but certainly it's not framed cognitively from the beginning as something of their own.
Thank you for that. Henrik or Aisha, did you want to jump in? Otherwise, I'll move to the next question.
The next question.
Okay, great. So this is from Jackie Lerner, Professor of Applied Developmental Psychology, Boston College, Lynch School of Education and Human Development. I have a question about what goes on at the program level for youth. I would love to hear thoughts on where to put resources when funds are low. For example, I do research in low resource youth developmental settings. I'm always asked by practitioners where to put their limited resources to have the most impact within the program. My PYD research shows that individuals are one of the most important assets for youth to thrive. I wonder if others agree, and what else would you add to that? Great question.
Since I have a bias and as my colleagues continue to think about it, first of all, thank you, Jackie Lerner, for that question. I am biased toward the arts, and there are kind of wonderful youth development programs that are centered on arts-based work. Some of it has been funded by the Wallace Foundation, but certainly other pieces of work. And when I say the arts, is not simply, the fine arts, but the different forms of art that in which young people can be engaged in, kind of understanding the ways in which they are unpacking. And then the other is to focus a little bit more on children's or young people's understandings of the civic process. They love that. I run a project here. I do mostly early childhood work, but I have this one project with youth, and they show up every other week to my surprise for about 3 hours. And they create a range of projects that are culturally focused and community-based. And mostly though, in addition to the work that they do, and the projects are, quite impressive, it's the opportunity to talk about issues that they are not able to talk about in schools. And of course, talk about at length in schools. They talk about them in schools. And so this space creates an opportunity to flesh out issues that are important to them. They come well informed, but I think creating a space for young people ones who are great students and the ones who may struggle in school, to come together, hear ideas, and be a part of something larger.
Thank you.
I'd have a quick answer to that. I know much less about early childhood than many people on this panel, but I've done an awful lot of work on K-12 education. And I think the answer to what do you do with the funds is not a single answer. It's not a single answer like reduce class size, more PD. I think what you need to do is figure out work hard to discuss what are your goals, and then do a needs assessment. And what are the obstacles to making progress towards those goals? And what can we put our money into that will help us to relax some of those obstacles? It'll be different in different settings.
Right, thank you. Yeah, my research is on adolescents actually in out-of-school time settings. And in my US-based work, I do research mostly on 4-H, which has a huge civic engagement component. But when I'm in Africa and, practitioners are like, we have no more money. How do we make what little we have work? And they want evidence-based answers. So yeah, I appreciate it. It's going to be different. It's just very difficult to see, it's not a cookie cutter approach anywhere. So we found that individuals are a huge asset. It's just the way to get them to pay for them and all that. So thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you for being here, Jackie. That's a great question. Just a reminder, you can also ask questions, well, to anyone that you see pinned to your screen, including Earl, Catalina, Katarina, even maybe. So feel free not to volunteer you all, but let's move to the next question. Again, feel free to keep submitting them. This is from Vicki Banyard from School of Social Work at Rutgers, New Brunswick in New Jersey. She says, I appreciate this conversation and especially the systems, policy, and global perspectives. Very thought-provoking. As a violence prevention researcher, I wonder how the panelists see the intersection of trauma exposure with these issues and with thriving. That's a great question. Any thoughts on that?
I just had one quick thing. I spent some time working in the Boston Public Schools, and I remember talking with a principal of a middle school, very experienced, very skilled principal, and she reported that she's having an awful time keeping teachers because she has the school has a growing number of kids from Central America who experience terrific horror where they come from. And they're not bad kids by any means, not that there are bad kids, but they're kids who act out just because of the trauma they've experienced. And it's so hard for teachers to deal with that. And there's a real need for the social workers and the skilled professionals to support those children's emotional needs. And that's critical to them being able to learn. It's critical for teachers to be able to teach.
Thank you, Richard. Anyone else? Aisha, yes.
So I think there's a couple of things, at least in the parenting space, and traditionally, at least in the global space, there's been kind of two different emphases in parenting program. Either you focus on a violence prevention parenting program, or you focus on a child development, child learning promotion parenting program. And even though often the ingredients, at least for the very young children, are similar, right? You need to support families. And so I think there is more of an understanding and more of concerted effort to bring these things together. So when we're talking about parenting program, we are addressing things like violence prevention, like managing difficult or challenging behaviors better, as well as being able to promote an environment where children are going to develop healthily and to learn. And so I think that's one piece of it. We need to figure out how many things can we put into these programs that are still manageable to be effectively delivered. I think the other part of that is thinking about the frontline workers. So been doing some work internationally where we also need to recognize that home visitors, community health workers are from the same communities. They're often exposed to the same traumas, the same stresses. And if they recognize and understand what families are experiencing, but they also are taking on the stresses and the responsibility of care when they make these visits or serve in their communities. And so I think part of some of our thinking going forward has to put more emphasis on how we're also supporting home visitors and community health workers to deal with the stress, to deal with the trauma, which goes beyond just thinking about burnout. That's also incredibly important, but it goes beyond that as well.
Thank you, Aisha. Earl, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to add to this?
Yeah, and I think Jacqueline brought up a really good, important point of the people matter, right? And really investing in the people is really important. And how do we utilize resources and where those resources go? So when I think about school violence, I think about safety, how we perceive safety in schools. Oftentimes we have resource officers, we have a presence of police within schools who are really expensive. However, those may not be the best people we need in schools. And so how do we bring in different adults to provide those mentoring supports, to intervene in violence, but also to provide opportunities for mentorship that allows people to be able to see beyond their current conditions. I think that's a really important part of how we think about it, and also how we need to reallocate our resources. If we bring in folks who are bridges to the community, lessen the load of teachers, so teachers do not have to do all that themselves, we can have a lot of very, very different outcomes within our schools, and also allow people to be able to focus in on their particular roles, but also have wraparound supports around our actual children.
Great point. Richard, did you want to
Just
add?
one quick plug. One of the things Mary Walsh found years ago and used in developing her City Connects program is there are settings in which there are resources, but they're not well matched to the needs of individual children. And that's what City Connects does, is provide that matching. And the evidence from randomized controlled trials is very encouraging. So I would encourage those who are listening who don't know about City Connects to learn about it.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, Henrik, go ahead.
Just quickly add, so context may differ, but having health and mental health professionals in schools have, at least here in Norway, also created tension where teachers and other professions struggle to align their roles with students. So what's been a focus here has been a more kind of within school systemic work on finding ways of collaborating between different professional groups in schools, which obviously are needed in the situation described here.
Really interesting perspective. Thank you so much, Henrik. Well, that concludes our panel. I'm going to turn it back to Eric to close us out. Thank you so much to all of you amazing panelists and to our audience. Eric, back to you.
Well, goodness, thank you so much, Jackie. Yes, and our amazing panel, as well as our invited respondents, and for all of you who were either joining the chat or just simply here to listen, just what a wonderful, just amazing amount of wisdom, insight, challenge, and motivation that I feel like our panelists have provided, and just really appreciate that in the ways that you've inspired us and are also contributing to the work. So thank all of you. And I do want to just say we are also deeply interested in continuing to have connections with all of you and the Center for Thriving Children. And so in the chat, you'll find ways to follow the work that we're doing and more exciting events and initiatives. But for now, just thank you to this wonderful panel, to Jackie, to our respondents, and to all of you who've come. Well wishes. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye. We'll see you soon.